A pale dawn smeared across the sky like soot on vellum, ash gray, bruised violet, the colors of a battlefield long faded. The light crawled over the frost-bitten fields with the stillness of regret, touching stones, furrows, and frost slick. Thorns with indifferent fingers beneath a crumbling archway, just outside the walls where the town's shadow faded into wild earth. A man knelt. He was motionless, save for the slow, practiced rhythm of his hands. Leather-wrapped fingers worked over the length of a blade, a long knife, not ceremonial, not noble, a tool, a sentence. The cloth he used was stiff with old blood, black and rust-brown, crusted with the memory of other nights, other bodies, other names he had never spoken aloud. His breath steamed into the morning air, rising like the ghost of a prayer he no longer remembered how to say. He moved without hurry, without hesitation. There was no glory at work, only necessity, the town. Behind him stirred in whispers, a market crier clearing his throat, a latch creaking open, a rooster too cold to crow. But no one called the man under the arch. They never did. Some called him the rider without livery. Others, nothing at all. A shadow was safer than a name. Shadows could pass through villages unnoticed, eat from trenchers beside fires, sleep in barns whose owners looked the other way. He slept where walls leaned and floors gave softly underfoot, in abandoned mill lofts, under pews in chapels where the saints had long stopped listening. He'd been killed the night before. A merchant, or a thief, or a man who had taken too much from the wrong hands. He no longer asked. He simply weighed the coin. He felt the hunger in his stomach, the cold in his knuckles, and the ache of memory of a child once taken from him under a lord's decree. Of a wife who died waiting for bread. Now, he was the reckoning. He was silent after the scream. He flexed his hand again. The fingers were slow to obey, stiff from cold and guilt. He remembered the way the man had folded, like cloth pulled from a nail. No struggle, only shock, and then the sagging flesh returned to the earth. A bell tolled prime. The first hour of prayer. The hour when the monks above would begin their song, their voices echoing in stone chambers while he crouched here, beneath a ruined arch, washing sins from steel. He did not turn his head. That world, the world of incense, of bells, of absolution, was no longer his. He moved to the edge of the stream, where the water cracked under a thin sheet of ice. He broke it with the butt of his knife, a sharp crack, like a bone snapping, and dipped the blade into the cold. The blood swirled outward, red against silver, and faded. The stream did what the church could not. It took the guilt and carried it away. Behind the trees, his horse waited. A dark mar, half-starved but loyal, her breath blooming in the dawn like incense from a low altar. He mounted without speaking, pulling his scarf up over his face, hiding what was already half-forgotten. No one would stop him. No one would follow. In the next village, there would be a whispered name, a grievance, a sack of coins, another door left unlatched in the night, another prayer left unanswered, and he would wait again, in shadows and smoke, beneath a sky that never forgave. The wind rose behind him, carrying with it the scent of ash and ice. And he rode forward into the white light of morning, a man made not of flesh or faith, but of consequence. The flame danced low, licking the base of the wick like a creature dying in its den. Shadows swelled and shrank with each creak of the floorboards above boots pacing. Voices muttering, a tankard dropped. A burst of drunken laughter cut short by the storm pushing in through the shutters. Beneath it all, in the cellar where rot bloomed between salt barrels and brine-stained crates, the man they called Thorn did not move. His elbows rested on the edge of a rough-hewn table, fingers laced, head bowed not in prayer, but in calculation. His cloak hung damp around his shoulders, the hem stiff with soot and road dust. The candle cast his hood into a black pool, but it could not hide the hollows beneath his cheekbones, or the cracked line of his mouth, set hard against whatever Memory clawed at him in the silence. Across the table, a courier sat rigid young, cloaked, breathing in shallow bursts. His hand, still half raised, trembled as Thorn took the sealed parchment without glancing at it. The wax was red, stamped with a crest now unrecognizable in the dim. Thorn slid it into his boot with a slow, mechanical grace, the kind that comes from repetition. From discipline born of darker vows, he did not speak, just nodded once. That was enough. The courier fled like a shadow losing its master. His boots echoed up the steps, and then only the sound of dripping water remained, fat drops from the beams above. Cold as regret, Thorn leaned back. The wall behind him was wet with old moisture, but he welcomed the discomfort. It reminded him he was still tethered to flesh, however loosely. His eyes closed, not in rest. In permission, a memory came unbidden, unwelcome. But he let it pass through him. The wind in rye fields. Sunlight caught in a bucket at the well. His sister's voice, lifted in a tune she swore was older than the stones. His mother's hands cracked, warm, steady pressing flour across a board, humming under her breath. A loaf rising beside a hearth that no longer stood. The heat of that fire, and then the heat of another, crueler one. Smoke, screams. A name screamed once in warning. His name, now even he could not remember it. He opened his eyes. The candle had burned lower, bleeding wax down the neck of an old wine bottle. The parchment pressed against his ankle like a brand. Somewhere above, the tavern grew quiet stormlight leaking through warped shutters, pooling in the corners like ash. It would be time soon. He always moved by dusk. The rooftops offered shadows the streets could not. From above, the city resembled a chessboard forgotten by its players. Each mark was a piece. Each night, a new game. But there were no victories. Only movements. He never stayed for the fall. His hand drifted to the hilt beneath his cloak. It was bone-handled, worn smooth by years of use. Notched from armor, blood, and bone. He could draw it in silence. Strike in the pause between heartbeats. Vanish like smoke. He was good. Too good. And that, too, was a kind of punishment. Outside, snow coiled through the alleyways thin, searching fingers dragging through gutters and doorframes. It whispered against stone like a voice from beneath the earth. Somewhere, a hound barked and was silenced. The air carried the scent of iron and pine. It will freeze tonight. Thorn rose without sound, the bench barely shifting. He moved to the crates, shifted aside a mold-specked sack, and pulled free a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Within gloves, coiled rope, a thin grappling claw, and a second blade, shorter, serrated. He packed swiftly, methodically, like a priest preparing a relic. But before he pulled up his hood, before the final tether to the man beneath the stone ceiling was cut, he allowed himself one final indulgence. One more ghost to haunt him on the climb. A face, her face, the soot on his cheek, brushed gently by rough fingers. The way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with reverence, but with sorrow, as though she already knew what the world would make of him. What it would take. What it would leave. She had whispered his true name. Not Thorn, not an assassin, not a ghost, his name. And in that moment, standing in the cellar beneath a dying tavern, wrapped in damp wool and blood-earned silence, he almost remembered it. Almost. But the night was coming, and names could not be carried into the places he walked. By the time he reached the rooftops, he was only shadowed again, a whisper moving between chimneys. A breath of judgment in a sleeping city. The storm closed around him. And below, another candle escaped. The bell tolled low, muffled by fog, stretched thin across the sleeping river like a thread unraveling at the end of the day. It echoed through mist-thick air and seeped into the stone bones of the bridge, a final prayer for the dying light. The figure crossed slowly, hood low, cloak damp with river sweat. His horse moved without command, its hooves barely tapping the cobblestones, muffled by moss and moisture. The world had drawn inward, windows shuttered, torches snuffed, doors barred against the hush that had settled like a shroud. Only the mist moved freely, curling around doorframes and chimney flues, touching everything with the gentleness of a veil. He passed beneath the blackened arch of the watchtower, where sentries stood with bows idle in hand, their eyes dulled. By repetition and sleep, they did not see him, not truly. Perhaps they had once, when faces meant things. But that was long ago, when the road had names and strangers carried reasons. Now, the road gave nothing but silence. And the man gave nothing in return. Beneath his cloak, the stiletto rested cool against his ribs, its hilt worn smooth by years of grip and grief. He did not touch it. He did not need to. Its presence was enough. A reminder. A confession. He was not here to kill. Not tonight. He was here because something had stirred. A rumor carried through markets and manor halls, twisted in tavern talk and polished by fear. A name, his name spoken in a voice that once knew mercy, now turned to command. The boy he had spared was no longer a boy. The inn by the bridge still stood, though the plaster had cracked and the lantern above the side door flickered as if unsure of its own light. He entered from the alley, brushing past a stack of firewood damp with rot, past a cat too thin for winter, past a cellar door that groaned like a buried truth. Inside, the smell of boiled cabbage clung to everything, the walls, the table legs, the breath of the barkeep who didn't look up. He climbed the stairs without asking, without keys, without sound. The room was waiting. Cheap wood, a single bed, a basin of cold water, a window with a view of the courtyard. He sat at the sill, uncloaked now. His form held stillness, not rest, but readiness. The blade lay flat before him, parallel to the stone, edge catching a trace of light from the fog-drowned moon. His hands lay in his lap, palms upturned, fingers slack. Not empty. Listening. Below, a boy scrubbed the steps. The blood was fresh, still pink where water met stone, still thick in the corners where bristles could not reach. The boy hummed a tune, off-key and soft, a child's song twisted into a laborer's rhythm. Nobody asked why there had been blood. No one ever did. The assassin watched, not for the boy, but for the rhythm of the world, of the town, of the memory, threading its way toward him, like a noose woven of time. He had not come for vengeance. He had come for confirmation. To see if he had been remembered. And if so, how? Outside, the fog pressed close. The river below murmured in sleep, carrying the weight of frost and forgotten things. Its surface shivered, not from wind, but from presence, the slow breath of history pulling deep beneath its skin. He waited. Not because he feared what might come, but because once he had promised not to strike first. That promise had cost him, and it had saved him, and now it was all that marked the line between what he had become and what he refused to be. Across the square, a lantern flared, a window opened. Voices murmured inside, then fell silent. A figure moved in the lamplight, a man in furs, paunch-bellied, crowned with authority too new to wear comfortably. A constable, perhaps, or a memory given flesh. The assassin did not rise. He watched. Candles burned low in the corner of the room. Its wax puddled, slow as breath. The knife gleamed once, then faded. He would not act tonight. Not unless the silence broke. Not unless the boy below finished scrubbing. Unless the lamplighter called his name. But if the past came knocking, if debts once buried rose in the mist, he would answer. Not with wrath, not with cruelty, but with the stillness that comes before judgment, and the edge of a blade that remembered everything. Beyond the window, the fog thickened. The bell rang once more. The candle flickered. And the river whispered its final secret. To the stones. The wind caught the chapel door as he left, slamming it back with a groan like old bones shifting beneath a crypt. The rain met him full in the face, sharp and cold, a baptism not of grace, but of reminder. The kind that stung rather than cleansed. His boots struck puddles along the cloister path, water rising in bursts that mirrored blood, not the kind from memory, the kind still fresh beneath his fingernails. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He knew the shape of what he had done. He knew the weight it left in his joints, in the part of his spine that refused to straighten. Behind him, the chapel lights danced weakly in the stained glass windows, two flickering flames, holding vigil in a world that had long stopped watching. Pulled his cloak tighter, but it was already soaked through. It clung to him like a second skin, one he could not shed. Not anymore. The streets were empty. Even the dogs had vanished from the alleys, and the lanterns on the walls sputtered with more smoke than fire. Storms like this emptied cities of sound, of witness. They carved out space for men like him to move unseen. And yet, tonight, he moved slowly, not like a hunter, but like a man carrying a question too large to answer, a question with no words. Only wait. He turned down a narrow passage near the tannery. It stank of rot and lye and old hides strung up to cure, but it was familiar. He passed the iron grate where the rats gathered in warmer seasons, where broken bottles gleamed like teeth in the gutter. Past the wall where a lover once carved initials before a crusade that never ended, not truly. Past the oak post where a thief had been hanged last winter. His body froze stiff before the rope snapped in the thaw. Each step returned something he'd buried. Faces without names, laughter without joy, orders barked and swallowed like sour bread. His gait slowed, his breath steamed. A cart passed in the distance, its wheels groaning under sacks of grain. He didn't turn his head. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to feel something, but nothing came. Only the thunder. Distant now, like hooves galloping in the sky. He reached the yew tree at the wall's edge, its roots gnarled and slick with moss, its bark pocked with age. He knelt, brushing aside the damp leaves with a hand that still trembled slightly. Whether from cold or something deeper, he could not say. The purse was still there, buried beneath stone and soil, untouched. He stared at it for a long while. Gold. Payment. Proof. And yet it repelled him now, as if the earth itself had turned it foul. He left it where it lay. It would buy nothing he needed. Not sleeping, not forgetfulness, not absolution. Behind him, the storm softened to a hush. The town exhaled. He looked up at the chapel spire, barely visible now through the thick curtain of rain. A memory stirred, faint and distant. A boy in clean linen. A woman's voice reciting verses he never understood. A hand on his shoulder. That meant safety. That meant home. That hand was gone now. That name too. He was not that boy. But he was not just that man. Candles still burned behind the stained glass. He could see them, two flickers of warmth in a world grown cold. Not enough to light a path, but enough to mark the place where memory still waited, where ghosts still knelt, where something like mercy, distant and silent, had not yet turned its face away. He turned his collar up, stepped back into shadow, and walked on, not toward a destination, but into the space between guilt and redemption. Coins would remain buried. Some debts were better unpaid. Some nights the only justice was a prayer never spoken, and a flame left burning for the soul that dared to kneel. The wind stirred the branches above like monks shifting in prayer. Leaves whispered their dry secrets as the last of the dusk bled into night, soaking the forest in layers of shadow and breathless cold. In that twilight hush, the assassin moved again, slow, deliberate, like a blade pulled from a sheath. His horse followed, reluctant but loyal, hooves pressing soft circles into the loam. The trees were ancient here, gnarled things that remembered. Centuries, wars, oaths broken under moonlight. Every root he stepped over was a grave of something once trusted. His hands, scarred and calloused, flexed around the reins. Not to guide, but to feel. To remind himself that he was still made of flesh, and not only the deeds it had carried out. Far behind, The smoke from a murdered lord's hearth still curled upward, unnoticed, into the indifferent sky. He had left. No note, no mark, no whispered name. The lord's body would be found slumped over letters that would never be answered, letters sealed in wax and ambition. Power had made that man cruel. But power also made men forget they were mortal. And in forgetting, they became easy to end. The forest knew no titles, only footsteps, only silence. He stopped once beneath an ash tree bent sideways with age. There, he listened not with ears, but with instinct. The assassin had learned long ago that danger never announced itself. It crept. It paused when you paused. It breathed when you breathed. Nothing moved, only the faint rush of wind through the needles, the distant shuffle of deer, the slow exhale of the horse at his side. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a length of red silk faded, frayed at the edge. He stared at it for a long time, not like a man remembering, but like one trying to forget. She had tied it around his wrist the last time she saw him. For luck, she'd said. But he had never been lucky, only fast, only quiet. Only gone. The silk had lasted longer than her voice. He wound it around his wrist again, pulled his cloak tighter, and moved on. The path narrowed, grown over in places by bramble and rot. No torch lit his waylight, betrayed more than it revealed. He knew the forest by feel, by pattern. He moved like a man walking through his memory. A fox darted across the trail ahead, its eyes catching what little moonlight filtered through the trees. He stopped to watch it vanish into the brush. Wild things never lingered, neither did he. But still, part of him remained in that last place, the warm study, the flicker of firelight against polished silver, the soft gasp as the Lord recognized. The face that had once begged for mercy beneath his banner. That moment had not lasted long. They never did. Now. The weight of that silence pressed against his spine, familiar as the hilt at his hip. He paused at the edge of a stream, kneeling to wash his hands. The water bit at his skin, cold and quick. Blood washed away easily in running water. But he'd learned long ago it stayed in the joints, in the knuckles, in the dreams. When he rose, the forest had darkened. Mist had crept in low, coiling between tree roots like breath held too long. The stars were veiled, the sky unreadable. But ahead, just beyond the trees, the faintest glimmer of lantern light. A village. He did not know its name. He rarely asked. There would be faces there. Ale, coin-changing hands for tasks unspoken. Or perhaps not tonight. Perhaps just a corner of a barn and sleep without dreams. He adjusted the satchel on his shoulder, the poisons clinking softly against metal. His fingers brushed the silk ribbon once more, then let it fall beneath the fold of his sleeve. Another mile. Another silence. He stepped forward, swallowed by fog. Behind him, the forest closed its mouth again. And ahead, under lantern light and watchful eyes, waited the next question his blade would answer. The sky over the harbor hung low with clouds, pale and streaked with rust, like an old wound yet to close. Waves rolled in slow and sullen, brushing the stone quay with the weariness of 1,000 years. And in the hush between their rhythms, the gulls cried sharp, broken-throated, like children calling to gods that no longer answered. He stood alone beside the fishmonger's stall, where wooden slats sweated brine and seaweed clung to ropes, in stiff green curls. The air reeked of salt and old scales, of lives dragged from the deep and sold without mourning. Around him, men shouted prices, haggled over mackerel, argued about weight and coin. But he heard none of it. His ears were tuned to other things, the creak of a gangplank lowering, the cough of a man who tried to hide fear behind fatigue, the footsteps that didn't belong. He watched the ship as it bobbed gently against the dock, its hull bearing a false name scorched into borrowed timbers. A merchant vessel, on paper. But he had followed her across coasts, from the Levant to Languedoc, beneath a dozen skies and through the silence of many nights. She carried more than spices and silk. She carried the memory. The man he had tracked would come ashore soon older. Now slower, no longer cloaked in white or bearing a red cross on his chest. But it was him, the Templar, who had ordered it, who had signed his name beside a fiery set, who had once looked upon the dying and said, "Let it be done." He had not seen the assassin then. Just another foot soldier, another shadow among banners. But shadows remember. Now the killer waited without armor, without emblem. Just rough spun and a fig in his palm, the skin dry and cracked like the soil of a homeland that had buried its gods beneath stone and sand. He chewed slowly, the sweetness. Hollow. Once, figs had grown behind the wall of a convent where he had found a kind hand, a whispered blessing. Before war stripped the world of softness. Before every name became ash. The fig was gone. The stall behind him bustled again. A boy shouted about oysters. Somewhere, a cat yowled from beneath a crate. He turned his head slightly. No sudden movement, no sign. Just enough to see the Templar's boots touch earth. Leather, oiled, spurred. The gait was the same. Proud, blind. The assassin's fingers twitched, but not toward his blade. Not yet. The steel waited for nightfall. Nestled in the shadows of a warehouse that smelled of pitch and rats. There, he would reclaim it. There, he would finish what had once been etched in flame across the backs of women and boys and priests who had offered no resistance, only prayers. The Templar passed him. Did not look, did not see. Mercy, once shown in war, becomes camouflage in peace. But this was not peace. The assassin turned and followed, not close, not too far. Just enough to keep the thread unbroken. Through the alleys they went, where tavern. Doors hung crooked and sailors stumbled out laughing, red-faced and soaked in bad wine. Past the chapel where the bell tolled again, solemn and dull, as if ashamed to ring for a town built on betrayal. He paused at the chapel steps. The Templar was gone from view, swallowed by the lower district. But that did not matter. He stood beneath the bell tower, listening. Years ago, he had stood in another chapel, on another coast. A boy then, kneeling, his knees bruised against stone, a priest's voice overhead, oil on the brow, a promise of light. But war makes liars do such things. He did not cross himself. Instead, he turned toward the sea once more, watching the tide retreat. It would rise again before matins, and so would he. Later, in the black hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath and men mistake sleep for safety, he would return to the warehouse. His blades would greet his hands like old companions. And the Templar, now smuggler, now man of silver and schemes, would be shown the mercy he once denied. Not vengeance, not wrath, just an ending, soft as salt in a wound. Until then, the assassin remained motionless, faceless, another soul stitched into the salt air. And the sea, in its ancient rhythm, whispered that all debts are eventually paid, even this one. The snow fell like ash from a quiet heaven, blanketing the rooftops of Prague. In pale sorrow, it softened the edges of the world, cloaking towers and chimneys in a hush older than time. Beneath the weathered gaze of Saint Sebastian, his stone limbs pierced with sculpted arrows, his expression locked in martyr's calm, a figure in black, watched the mourners win through the square, their footsteps swallowed by the snow. No one wept loudly. This was not a death that demanded wailing. It was dignified, decorous. A minor noble, pious, generous, taken, they said, by the chill of winter and a heart worn thin. But the killer knew better. He had stood in the antechamber, silent as dust, crouched where floorboards groaned and mice had learned to avoid traps. The poison had kissed the cork with a lover's delicacy, an alchemist's art honed across borders and years. It left no stain, no scent. Just a smile on the lips of a dying man who believed his final drink was safe. The bells rang for that. Lie now, pealing through the whitened air, their tones pure and cold. And the man in black, no longer a boy, no longer a name, stood motionless beneath the statue that had once frightened him as a child. Then Saint Sebastian's pain had seemed unbearable. Now it was almost comforting. At least the saint had been seen. He turned before the bells ceased their mourning. His boots left shallow prints in the snow, already fading as the flakes resumed their fall. Through narrow alleys he moved, past doors with iron hinges, past taverns where the breath of men clouded window panes and candles flickered against laughter. He did not pause. These sounds were not his. Laundry lines stretched above his head like garlands strung between forgotten lives. The linens had frozen solid, stiff ghosts flapping in the wind. He passed beneath them like a shade returned to the land of the living, above a cooper's shop with shuttered eyes and a door swollen with damp. A room waited. Small, cold, known. He climbed the back stair, fingers wrapped in thin gloves, each step a reminder of joints that ached more than they once had. Inside, he pulled the door shut without a sound and unwrapped the scarf from his neck. The air smelled of sawdust and vinegar, of winter and wood, of survival. A bowl sat on the table, chipped and plain. He poured vinegar into it from a bottle, wrapped in waxed cloth, and washed his hands. The sting bit into the skin where the poison had kissed him in return. He welcomed it. Pain was a kind of prayer. It reminded the body that it was not yet a ghost. The vinegar carried a scent he did not expect. His mother's kitchen, once, long ago, where jars of pickled onions lined the shelf beside threadbare candles. She had hummed there, a tune without words. He had forgotten it until now. For a moment, the assassin closed his eyes. He almost smiled, but time did not permit such indulgences. The wax-sealed parchment would come soon, slipped beneath the door. Like a sin no priest could absolve. The code would be familiar, the name unfamiliar. The outcome inevitable. He did not light a fire. The cold was safer. Fire begged questions. Fire could betray. Instead, he sat by the window, where the panes wept with frost and the city stretched out beneath him like a dream half remembered. In the square, the mourners had gone. The snow remained, loyal and slow, covering every footprint, every secret. His hand rested on the table. It did not tremble. For this 1 hour, no blade weighed at his hip, no mask covered his breath. No lie clung to his name. He existed, not as vengeance, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as the boy who once ran through these streets, chasing pigeons and laughing. The boy who kissed a girl whose apron smelled of flour. The boy who once believed that names meant something, that justice wore armor, that truth was louder than silence. He exhaled, long and quiet. Tomorrow would bring orders. Another face, another mask, another silence to be bought and buried. But tonight, there was only Snowdot and a man wrapped in memory, watching the city forget him again. The wind clawed at the shutters like something half forgotten, half alive. It sang down the chimney in tones older than language, low, mournful, insistent. Within the hilltop inn, where the roof sagged and the timbers creaked like ribs under strain, the last of the fire had settled into its death. Red coals dimmed beneath a blanket of pale ash. Smoke drifted upward in threads, thin as ghosts. He sat at the hearth's edge, hat brim casting his face into shadow. His hands were still, except for one finger tracing slow circles around the rim of an untouched tankard. Not out of thirst, not out of ritual, but out of memory. Each turn summoned something buried, a name once spoken, a place once burned, a woman who once held his face in trembling hands and whispered, "You're more than this." He had been riding for 3 days, crossing frost-hardened roads and listening to the silence between hoofbeats. Always the silence. It followed him, closer than any shadow. It lived in him now, curled beside the part of him that still flinched at mercy. The tavern was nearly empty. The innkeeper had disappeared into the back rooms. muttering about cold cellars and leaking barrels. No patrons remained. Only a mutt curled near the hearth, twitching in dreams. The killer did not move. He waited. Outside, the wind shifted again, bringing with it the sound of iron distant horseshoes on stone. He noted it, but did not turn. This was not the night. That would come later, when it mattered. In his coat pocket, a letter waited, green wax, unbroken. The seal, unmistakable, a sword piercing an iron key. The mark of those who spoke not in words, but in deaths. He had seen that seal only once before, on a night when fire swallowed a manor house and the man inside had died whispering the name of a son long dead. The symbol had appeared in his life like a curse and remained ever since, resurfacing when silence turned to hunger. He would open it later, when the doors were barred, when the light was low, when the world felt far enough away to remember who he was beneath the skin of obedience. For now, he listened to the tick of the wood cooling, to the whisper of wind through shutter cracks, to the hush that came before an order was read aloud in the mind. He did not fear the letter. Fear had long been trained from him, but he resented it, because he knew deep in the place where grief still lived without language, that this letter would not be the last, that whatever it demanded, he would do it, because to stop was to become still. And stillness, for men like him, was not peace. It was rotten. He stood, finally, the tankard still full. His shadow stretched along the floorboards, long and gaunt like a man in chains. The dog did not stir. Even the coals did not protest out at the door. He paused. Snow drifted in slow spirals beyond the threshold. Cold met him as an old friend, familiar and indifferent. He drew his cloak tighter, pulled the brim of his hat low, and stepped into the dark. The night swallowed him. No footsteps remained. No coin upon the table. Only the memory of a figure that had once been human, had once bled for something softer, had once believed that justice lived in the barrel of a night's cry. But now he serves rhythm, the rhythm of wax-sealed letters, of quiet entries and quieter exits, of sins too precise to name. Back inside, the wind whistled through the empty doorway, a sound like breath or regret. And somewhere far from the hilltop, in a stone chamber lit by torchlight, another letter was being sealed. Another symbol pressed into wax. Another name written in a language that no longer cared what men had once dreamed. The road ahead was long, and in the folds of the killer's cloak, silence rode beside him once more faithful, waiting never far. There would be no peace, but there would be a purpose, and the wind would carry his name. Only after the final task was done, a crow landed on the lintel of an empty stall, its claws scratching wood worn soft by decades of market noise and muddy footprints. It tilted its head, black eyes unblinking, watching the man below who did not move. The square was still half asleep. A silence held between breaths, pierced only by the distant creak of a cartwheel or the rustle of frost-shriven cloth in the wind. Snow clung to the corners of canvas awnings, to shutters not yet opened. Beneath the scent of smoke and sea and morning bread, there lingered the metallic ghost of iron and old blood, a scent only those who had known hunger or war could ever name. He stood motionless, leaning into shadow, back against a weathered post carved long ago by hands who had prayed to older gods. The symbols were worn, their meaning forgotten by the city, but he had once traced them with his fingers, whispered to them in languages the priests now called heresy. This place had changed. He had not. The dagger at his side was old, curved, the leather of its grip darkened by time and use. It had lived longer than many men, longer than the boy who had once begged in this very square. A boy whose name he could not speak aloud, not because he had forgotten, but because it still burned in his throat like ash. He watched the door across the square, not with urgency, with precision. The magistrate always emerged at the same time, as if the bells of the cathedral moved not by rope and arm, but by the rhythm of his stride. A man of velvet cuffs and clean fingers, of proclamations spoken behind veils of incense and law, of justice that forgot the poor. The killer had no banner, no coat of arms. He was not sworn to crown or coin, though both had used him like a whetstone. Today's commission bore no politics, no war, only grief silent and cloaked, passed from widow to assassin in a sealed letter marked only with a pressed flower. He had burned the letter in the woods outside the city walls, but he remembered every word. The magistrate stepped out now, surrounded by guards whose boots echoed on the stone like distant drums. His cloak fluttered in the wind, purple, lined with fur. His limp was subtle, but the killer saw it. I had seen it before, years ago. A rope, a boy too thin to carry his own shame. A magistrate looking on, expression unchanging, as the child. Kicked against the void. There had been nothing to do then. Nothing but remember. Now the guards moved ahead, parting the still sleeping market like prow waves through a harbor. The magistrate moved behind them, gloved hand brushing snow from his cuff, oblivious to the weight of being seen. The killer's breath coiled, in the air, steady, measured. He would not move yet. The square began to wake. A fishmonger opened her shutters. A boy swept ash from beneath a bread oven. A bell chimed somewhere far off. Morning began like a tide, quiet, inevitable. He knew how it would go. The magistrate would cross the square. He would speak to the apothecary. He would mount the steps of the weighhouse. And in that moment, among the clatter of hooves, the rattle of coin, and the scent of yeast and snow and sweat, the blade would find the place just beneath the ribs, quietly, cleanly. A breath. Nothing more, but not yet. The killer let the moment stretch. I saw the man live. Watched the city unfold itself around him like a blooming wound, not out of mercy, but to remember. That time is not infinite, that every breath taken is a debt, and that some debts, even across years, are not forgiven, only delayed. A child's laughter rang out as a girl chased pigeons across the frost. For a heartbeat, he remembered being her, and the boy beside her. The boy who had been taken. The magistrate's voice echoed across the square, barking orders. The killer stepped into the crowd, silent, certain, like dusk arriving beneath a clouded sky. The square did not notice. Not yet. A torch sputtered in its sconce, casting a trembling halo over the cold stone wall. Shadows swayed like ghosts behind a tapestry that hadn't been lifted in years. Dust hung in the air like ash. Beneath that tapestry, unmoving as carved obsidian, the man waited. Not with hesitation, but with a patience forged in darker chambers. Than this, he had come alone, always alone. The world of banners and alliances had long ceased to concern him. Oaths were just words, easily broken, and even more easily forgotten. But memory that was harder to kill, the crypt had let him in. The same way it had once let in mourners and monks, traitors and thieves. Few alive remembered the tunnels, curved beneath the earth, where cold air wept from the bones of the long dead, and where moss grew thick in the silence. But he remembered. He always remembered. Tonight, the castle above slept in ignorance. Servants dreaming of bread. Sentries pacing in boredom. Lords behind heavy doors, drunk on their own safety. And somewhere, beyond that velvet-draped corridor, the chamberlain breathing lies into the dark. The killer's breath was steady. His dagger had not shifted since he fastened it there, snug against his forearm, steel-kissed with oil and silence. It had ended many lives, not in anger, not even in revenge. Simply in balance. Justice its oldest form. He moved now slowly, with the poise of a man who had mapped every creaking board, every flickering torch. Through narrow halls and forgotten stairwells, past statues with broken faces and windows smeared with condensation. A whisper of wool. A breath caught before every turn. The corridor to the chamberlain's door was lit by a single lamp, half dead and hissing. The warmth of it made the chill in his chest feel colder. He stopped just outside. The door was ajar, as expected. The man inside had always been careless in comfort, and yet the killer did not enter. He stood there, gaze fixed on the faint glow that spilled from the room. He could hear the gentle creak of the bed frame, the occasional mumble of sleep. Words that meant nothing, names lost to dreams, and something else, a glint of gold resting on a table just inside. A ring dot. It was not the gold that stilled him, nor the gem, but the crest etched into it. A stag rearing over a field of stars. That ring had once rested on the hand of his father, a steward of a noble house brought low by rumor, accusation, exile. A man broken not by war, but by betrayal from within the same betrayal the Chamberlain had now sold to the French. For a breathless moment, past and present blurred. He remembered his father's hand, strong yet gentle, pressing the boy's shoulder on the morning they fled. He remembered the sound of coins dropped into a river, the family seal sinking into dark water. He remembered hunger, shame, wandering. Now, that seal lay again in this place, worn by the traitor. The killer stepped forward. He did not hesitate. There was no cry, only a rustle of wool, a single exhale, and the faint thud of a body settling. He did not stay, did not search the chamber for secrets or scrolls. He placed the ring gently on the man's chest, folding the hand over it. A gesture, not forgiveness, not even a warning, just a question. Who had his father become? And what blood had passed between oaths and gold? The bell in the castle tower began to toll softly for matins. The sound rolled through the stone like breath through lungs once stilled. He was gone before the third bell rang through the crypt once more, into the dark. Snow had begun to fall outside the walls, fine, cold grains carried on the wind like scattered ash. He pulled his cloak tighter. The next commission would come soon. Another sealed letter. Another face. But this one, the ring, the name, the echo of his father's house would not vanish easily. As he walked into the white hush of morning, the memory followed, and somewhere behind him a door swung gently on its hinges, letting in the cold, letting out the past.